Hello, I'm Anne-Sophie Chelbaya, and this is my partner Jean-Benoit Gambet. Hello. Today we are very happy to be making a video on biodiversity and explain the issues involved. And in particular on how to take biodiversity into account in investment decisions.
So we do it at the same time for pleasure, but also because it is an obligation. French regulations now mandate that all of the financial institutions, including insurance companies, banks, mutual insurance companies and asset management companies, must incorporate biodiversity considerations into their investment decisions.
Exactly, and that's precisely why, in this comprehensive and informative video, we're going to explain the precise obligations in terms of taking biodiversity into account. And above all, we will explain how to do it efficiently and effectively as we are used to doing.
Exactly, Anne-Sophie. So what are we going to talk about in this video? Well, in the first part, we're going to tell you the story behind the regulations so that you understand exactly where they come from and what they require. Then what are we going to talk about?
We're going to explain to you in concrete terms what a long-term biodiversity alignment strategy is, because that is what the regulations require you to do. And then we will also give you some line of thought.
And therefore, we are going to present you with operational risk matrices, concrete tools you will be able to use, and at the end of this video, ladies and gentlemen, you'll know how to implement the regulations. That is the Article 29 of the Energy Climate Act. And don't forget, the bravest of you will be given a gift, and you'll understand when you watch this video about halfway through. I'm already telling you too. And so, if you're working on these subjects, on biodiversity and in investment, I'm convinced that you'll find this video fascinating. Indeed, we have really put all our energy and passion into it. So let's start with a little story, the story of regulation. It is a wonderful story. Today, financial institutions must take biodiversity into account in their investment decisions. It's in the law. This law is called the Energy Climate Law. In Article 29, and here I'm going to ask Anne-Sophie, what does Article 7 of Article 29 of the Energy Climate Law say?
So yes, this famous Article 29 requires all management companies to have a strategy aligned with the long-term objectives of preserving biodiversity in compliance with the Convention on Biological Diversity, also called the CBD of 1992. So the story begins in 1992.
So we went to see this famous convention, we looked for it and we found it. In fact, you'll find all the links to the documents we're talking about in the video commentary. We went to open this convention of 1992. It's like a United Nations convention, the CBD, which meets about every year or every 2 years. In any case, they meet each other regularly. And so in 1992, when we opened it, we said to ourselves that there weren't any computers back then because it's typed, it's a scan of a typewriter. So the question is, what does this agreement say?
It sets out major objectives for the preservation of biodiversity, protected areas, etc., but it's very, very broad and not very operational.
You can go and read it, but we'd advise you against it, as I think it would be a waste of time.
Then in 2010, the UN met again and adopted what are known as the Aichi Objectives in 2010. These were a little more specific. You can see them on the screen. We're talking about reducing pollution, reducing the risk of extinction, protected areas, ecosystem services, etc. As you can see, it's a bit graphic and quite similar to the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs.
Even if the Aichi Objectives are very visual and rather well done, and you can already rely on them to draw up your alignment strategy, they were supplemented, or rather clarified, by the Convention on Biological Diversity of 2021. The convention, that is the CBD of 2021, defined 4 objectives. Anne-Sophie.
The first objective of the Convention on Biological Diversity is to improve and increase biodiversity. So it's a biodiversity stock objective.
The second objective deals with strengthening the services provided by nature, that is, ecosystem services. We will explain what these are a little later, but the second objective aims is to enhance, maintain and reinforce the services that are provided by the nature. Anne-Sophie.
The third objective is to ensure equal access to all ecosystem services. In other words, the use of nature must be distributed fairly and equitably among the entire population.
And finally, the fourth objective is simply to find the financial resources to achieve the first 3 objectives, that is the stock of biodiversity, ecosystem services, and equitable access to all these resources. Therefore, the regulations require you to have a strategy that enables you to align yourself with these 4 objectives that we have just told you about. But that doesn't really tell us, Anne-Sophie, how we go about aligning ourselves with these objectives in concrete terms.
Yes, absolutely. That's an excellent
That's why I'm
point. That is
proposing
why
that
I
you
would
go
like
back
to
to
take
what
you
the
back to
Article
what the
29
Article
requires.
29
So you'll
requires.
understand
You'll
exactly
understand
what the
exactly what the
regulations require of you.
regulations are asking
That's
of
perfect,
you.
Anne-Sophie. So I suggest you explain to us what the
It
Article
will be a great
29
pleasure. So the
requires.
Article 29 on biodiversity is very simple. Well, very simple in the text. It asks you to do two specific things. The first is to have a strategy aligned with long-term objectives in biodiversity. So the first one is strategy. And the second one is to integrate biodiversity and biodiversity risk into your risk management. So there are two things: strategy, risk management.
So, let's start with the first one, the alignment strategy. Could you please explain to us, Anne-Sophie, what a strategy of alignment with the long-term objectives of biodiversity is?
Yes, so the first thing obviously is to write and implement a policy aligned with the preservation of biodiversity, which must include both a measurement of the impact and dependence of investments on biodiversity, an analysis of the contribution of these investments to the four long-term objectives mentioned above, and then to report on all the tools that were used, the monitoring indicators, and the progress made. So all in all, this is how you align yourself with the CBD objectives, what indicators you use. And now we will look at the second thing that the Article 29 requires in terms of risk management.
So with regard to biodiversity risk management, the Article 29 again calls for two different and specific things. The first is to analyze the impact of biodiversity on businesses. Then the second is to analyze the impact of businesses on biodiversity. And that, in fact, it is what we call the principle of double materiality. I don't know if you remember it, but we already saw it in our videos about climate, where it was the same thing. We evaluate the impact of the climate on companies and the impact of companies on the climate.
In the case of biodiversity, the impact of biodiversity on the company is called physical risk or dependency risk. In other words, we're going to assess a company's dependence on biodiversity. And it's a physical risk quite simply because, to put it crudely, if biodiversity disappears, it will have a material impact on companies.
And the second risk, that is the impact of companies on biodiversity, which is called transition risk. This means that in practice today, the act of destroying biodiversity has no direct impact on the society. However, there is a transitional impact because in the future it will be less and less easy to have a negative impact on biodiversity without incurring a penalty. We'll have to pay to have a negative impact.
That's true, and the first thing, and we're already seeing this in market trends, is consumers turning away from products that have harmful effects on the environment or biodiversity. Secondly, regulations are appearing. Take, for example, the ban on single-use plastic in the food industry in 2003.
Another classic example that already exists, it is the carbon tax. You have to pay if you want to emit carbon dioxide, for example. The car industry has to do it.
So, to sum up, if you have a strong and negative impact on biodiversity today, there's a good chance that it will not last and that your tools and production system will have to evolve. And so that is what we call the transition risk. But I think you are asking here a question that is fundamental, even existential, which is, what do we really mean by biodiversity? What does it really mean?
What do we mean by biodiversity? Biodiversity, it is always presented in three formats, three things. Firstly, genes. Anne-Sophie and I are different. We have a different genetic code. So these are really here. We're biodiverse. The second thing is species. There are people, there are sheep, there are monkeys, there are earthworms, and there are also algae and oaks, etc. Everything that's alive we're going to take a look at. Everything that's alive, you might say. And then there is everything that is not living, but everything that is an ecosystem, that is a lake is part of biodiversity, a mountain is part of biodiversity, a small rock in a big forest is part of biodiversity because it is home to little worms or insects. The same goes for rivers. And so this biodiversity, it is very vast, but here again, to simplify things and keep this in mind, it can be broken down into 8 different categories.
8 assets of natural capital, that's very important. It's really going to come in handy when you come to analyze biodiversity. And these 8 natural capital assets are the atmosphere, the habitats, terrestrial geomorphy, that is the Earth's relief, that is mountains, hills, and so on. Minerals, ocean geomorphy, that is the relief of the oceans. Soil and sediments, species and water, so here it is. And so, in fact, what's important to understand is that biodiversity is very broad, as Jean-Benoit explained. Actually, it can be broken down into 8 natural capital assets, and then you can derive ecosystem services from these natural capital assets.